The moment Nadia grabbed that last umbrella off the airport rack, right before the man in the gray coat could reach it, she told herself it wasn't her fault he'd been 2 seconds too slow. She didn't feel guilty. Not really. She'd flown in from a 6-day conference in Chicago, her carry-on was soaked from the shuttle, and she had exactly 40 minutes to get to her sister's baby shower across town. If anything, she thought, the universe owed her this one. "Excuse me," the man said. Not rudely, but not politely either. Nadia turned. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of tired in his eyes that came from too many time zones and not enough sleep. He was looking at the umbrella in her hand like it was the last lifeboat off a sinking ship. "I only grabbed one," she said. "I can see that. There are others in the gift shop, down by gate B." He glanced toward the corridor. "My flight's in 40 minutes. Then you'd better hurry," Nadia said, and she walked out into the rain. She didn't think about him again. Not that day, not that week. She had a baby shower to get to, a presentation to revise, and a mother who called twice daily to ask why Nadia wasn't married yet at 28. There was no room in her brain for a stranger at the airport. Her mother's name was Florence, and she had what the family called the gift of arrangement. She'd arranged Nadia's uncle's second wedding. She'd arranged her coworker's daughter's entire engagement. She'd arranged the church choir schedule for 11 consecutive years. Florence believed deeply in her bones that things left to chance fell apart, and people left to their own romantic instincts were hopeless. Nadia was her greatest ongoing project. "I'm not interested in being set up," Nadia said the following Sunday, cutting sweet potatoes at her mother's kitchen counter, while Florence stood at the stove stirring something that smelled like it had been simmering since Thursday. "I didn't say set up. I said dinner. It's a dinner that I'm hosting. You'll be there. He'll be there. What happens after that is between you and God." Nadia set down the knife. "Who is he?" Florence stirred the pot with great intention. "He works with your Aunt Cecile's husband. Some kind of engineer, very accomplished. 32. Does he know this is a setup? I told you, it is not a mom." A pause. "I may have mentioned that my daughter would be joining us." Nadia picked the knife back up. She knew better than to argue with Florence when Florence had already decided something. It was like trying to talk a river out of running downhill. Easier to just show up, be polite for 2 hours and leave. "Fine," she said, "but I'm driving myself." The dinner was at her mother's house the following Friday. Nadia wore a green dress she liked and arrived exactly on time, which was her way of communicating that she wasn't nervous. She wasn't nervous. She walked through the front door and into the living room and stopped. Standing near the fireplace talking to her Aunt Cecile's husband was the man from the airport. He recognized her at exactly the same moment she recognized him. She could tell because his expression did the same thing hers probably did, a kind of involuntary recalibration, like a phone dropping signal and scrambling to find it again. He recovered faster than she did. "The umbrella," he said. Nadia's mother materialized at her elbow like a woman who had been waiting in the wings for this exact moment. "You two have met?" "Briefly," Nadia said. "At the airport," he said. "I'm Elliot, Nadia." Florence looked between them with the expression of a woman watching a souffle rise perfectly. "Well," she said, "dinner's almost ready." Over pot roast and her mother's famous cornbread, Nadia learned that Elliot was a structural engineer who'd been in Seattle for a project, that he'd grown up in Atlanta, that he had a younger brother he talked about with the kind of easy affection that told you he was probably a decent person, and that he had opinions about airport design that were, unexpectedly, quite interesting. She learned that he was funny in a dry, quiet way that she almost missed the first time. She did not tell him any of this. What she said, when her mother asked if she'd try the peach cobbler, was yes. What she said to Elliot was polite, courteous. She asked appropriate questions and gave appropriate answers and looked at her phone only once discreetly under the table. She drove home thinking he was fine, perfectly fine. That was other called at 9:47 p.m. "So? He was nice." "Mom, nice," Florence repeated with the tone of someone who had just been handed a participation ribbon. "That's all?" "That's all," a long pause. "He asked about you." Nadia held the phone against her shoulder and changed out of her green dress. "What do you mean he asked about you?" "He asked Cecile's husband if I thought you'd be open to getting coffee." She put the dress on a hanger, smoothed it out. "What did you say?" "I said I'd ask you, Mom. You should not be relaying messages between two adults like we're in middle school." "Do you want his number or not?" Nadia thought about the way he'd looked at her across the dinner table when she'd made a comment about the city's infrastructure that she hadn't expected anyone to pick up on, and he'd picked it up, and his eyes had done something careful and interested that she hadn't quite known what to do with. "Text it to me," she said. They got coffee on a Wednesday. Nadia chose the place, a small shop near her office, nothing romantic about it, bare wood tables and pour-overs and a chalkboard menu. Neutral ground. Elliot arrived before her, which she hadn't expected. He was sitting at a corner table with his jacket over the chair beside him, scrolling through something on his phone, and he looked up when she walked in and put the phone face down immediately. Like he wasn't going to be caught not paying attention. She noticed that. They talked for 2 hours. She hadn't planned on 2 hours. She'd planned on 45 minutes and a plausible excuse about a call at 11. But the call came and went, and she let it go to voicemail because Elliot was in the middle of telling her about a bridge project he'd worked on in Portland, and the way he described the problem they'd had to solve. The tension in his voice, the way his hands moved, she didn't want to interrupt it. They talked about her work too. She was a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center downtown. She'd wanted to be since she was 16, since she'd watched her grandfather relearn how to walk after his stroke, and seen the therapist who'd worked with him. The patience, the precision, the absolute refusal to give up on someone's body when everyone else had started to lower their expectations. Elliot listened the way good listeners do, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually following her, leaning in when she got to the parts that mattered. "You love it," he said when she finished. "I do. That's not as common as people think," he said. He wasn't being philosophical about it, he just meant it. She drove back to work thinking he was more than fine. She didn't tell anyone. They saw each other 4 more times over the next 6 weeks. Always coffee, once lunch. Nadia kept it casual, kept the pace measured, because she'd learned, the hard way with a man named Derek 2 years ago who'd moved fast and left fast, that momentum was not the same as connection. Elliot didn't push. He matched her pace, which she'd half expected would frustrate her. She half wanted him to push, a little, so she could push back and recalibrate. But he didn't, and that frustrated her in a different way entirely. Then the project at his firm ran long, and he had to fly back to Seattle for 3 weeks. He texted her from the airport. "Same terminal as last time. Bought an umbrella from the gift shop, covered my bases." She laughed out loud at her kitchen table, alone, and that was the moment she knew she was in real trouble. He came back in March. They had dinner, a real dinner, not coffee, at a restaurant she'd been wanting to try, and somewhere between the appetizers and the main course she looked at him across a candlelit table and felt the specific and inconvenient sensation of things clicking into place. She didn't say anything about it. He walked her to her car. It was cold and she was fumbling for her keys, and he said, "Nadia," very quietly, and she stopped fumbling. "I'd like to keep doing this," he said, "if you're open to it. Seeing each other, actually seeing each other." She looked at him. She thought about Derek. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone saying he asked about you. She thought about the bridge in Portland and 2 hours of coffee and a text about an umbrella that had made her laugh alone in her kitchen. "Okay," she said. He smiled. It was a small smile, not showy, just real. She liked it more than she wanted to admit. Things were easy in a way Nadia hadn't expected, not frictionless. There were misunderstandings. There were nights she wanted more words from him and he gave her silence. There were times she pulled back without explaining why, and he gave her the space she needed without knowing why she needed it. But underneath all of that, things were easy. She didn't have to explain herself from scratch every time. He already had the context. Her mother was unbearably pleased with herself, which Nadia tried to resent and mostly couldn't. "I just want to remind you," Florence said at Easter, while they stood at the kitchen counter, cutting the same sweet potatoes in the same positions they'd stood in every Easter for 20 years, "that I never said set up." "I know, Mom. I said dinner. I know." Florence smiled at the pot. "I'm just saying." Elliot, in the living room talking to Nadia's father, laughed at something her dad said, a real laugh caught off guard, and Nadia heard it from the kitchen and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Warm. Settled. Like a knot slowly releasing. 8 months in, Elliot got offered a position with a firm in Atlanta, his home city. He'd be closer to his family, better pay, a project he'd wanted to be part of for years. He told her over dinner, and she could see in his face that he'd already thought through the implications before he told her, which was very like him. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I asked first." He looked at her steadily. "I don't want to go if it means we stop." She took a breath. "I'm not going to tell you to turn down a career opportunity. That's not what I asked." Her fork. "I don't want to stop," she said. "But I also don't want you to stay somewhere and resent it later. And I don't want to do long distance forever. So what does that mean?" She looked at him across the table. She thought, not for the first time, about how much she trusted him. Not blindly, she'd done blind trust before, and she knew what the wreckage looked like. This was different. This was the kind of trust that had been built slowly, PPC, over 8 months of showing up and being honest and matching her pace without being asked to. "Take the job," she said. "Let's figure out the rest." He took the job. They figured out the rest. The long distance was not glamorous. It was late-night calls on weekdays when they were both too tired to say anything meaningful and said it anyway. It was 4-hour drives on weekends when the flights were too expensive. It was learning each other in smaller, more deliberate doses, which Nadia came to believe was its own kind of gift. She visited Atlanta in September. She met his mother, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Constance, who fed her twice what she could eat and asked her questions about her work with the focused attention of someone taking notes. She liked her immediately. She met his younger brother, too, who was exactly as easy and funny as the way Elliot had always described him. She saw in the way Elliot was around his family a version of him she hadn't seen before. Looser, more open, quicker to laugh. She filed it away like something valuable. On her last night in Atlanta, she and Elliot sat on the back steps of his apartment building because neither of them wanted to go inside yet. It was warm for September. The city hummed quietly around them. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking I like it here," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Would you ever consider—" "Don't ask me right now," she said. Not because the answer was no. Because she wanted to say yes from a place of choice, not from a night that felt like magic. And she knew herself well enough to know the difference. He nodded, he understood. That was the thing about him. She moved to Atlanta in January. It wasn't impulsive. She'd thought about it since September, had talked to her director about remote options, had taken one weekend in October to herself without telling anyone where she was going to sit in a coffee shop in Philadelphia and think through the decision like it was a problem she was solving on paper. She'd made lists. She'd called her best friend Tamara, who'd said, "Nadia, I love you, but if you overthink this, I will drive to your apartment and take your notebook away." She put in her notice in November. She found a clinic in Atlanta that was looking for a senior PT. She called her mother. Florence's silence on the phone lasted exactly 4 seconds, which was long by her standards. "Atlanta," she finally said. "Atlanta." Another 2 seconds. "When you have babies." Florence said, "I need at least 4 visits a year." Nadia laughed until she was almost crying. "Okay, Mom." She and Elliot found an apartment together in a neighborhood with old trees and a coffee shop on the corner, where the staff already knew their orders by February. Some mornings she'd wake up before him and lie there listening to the sounds of a city that was starting to feel like hers, and she'd think about the airport, that specific afternoon, her soaked carry-on, the last umbrella on the rack, the man in the gray coat reaching for it 2 seconds after she did. She thought about how close it had come to nothing. How if her flight had landed 10 minutes later, or he'd been 10 minutes earlier, or her mother had not been Florence, relentless, infuriating, unarguably right, none of it would have existed. She brought this up to Elliot one Saturday morning over coffee, while he was reading something and she was thinking out loud, which was a habit of hers he had long since stopped being startled by. "Do you ever think about how random it was?" she said. "The airport. If I hadn't grabbed that umbrella—" "You definitely grabbed it on purpose," he said without looking up from his reading. "I was in a hurry. You saw me reaching for it." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I was in a hurry," she said again. He looked up then, and smiled that small, real smile of his, and she felt the knot release again, the same way it had at Easter, that warm, settled feeling that didn't have a precise word but that she'd stopped needing to name. Her mother came to visit in April. She arrived with 2 suitcases, a casserole dish wrapped in foil, and opinions about the apartment's layout that she delivered within the first 4 minutes. On her second evening there, after dinner, Elliot cleared the table while Nadia and Florence sat with tea, and Nadia watched her mother watching him. The quiet, assessing look that Florence gave things she was deciding about. "He's good," Florence said quietly, once he'd gone into the kitchen. "I know," Nadia said. "He doesn't try to fill silence." Florence considered this. "That's hard to find." Nadia looked at her mother, this woman who had called twice a day and arranged the choir schedule and believed, down to her marrow, that love was too important to leave to chance. Who had invited a man her aunt's husband mentioned to dinner and called it not a setup with a perfectly straight face. "Thank you," Nadia said, "for the dinner, even though it was a setup." Florence lifted her chin. "It was a dinner." "Mom," a pause. Florence looked into her tea. "You're happy?" It wasn't a question, Nadia answered it anyway. "Yeah," she said, "I really am." 3 months later on a Tuesday evening, not a special occasion, not a planned moment, just a regular evening when Nadia had come home from a long shift, and Elliot had made pasta, and they were both on the couch with the television on, and neither of them really watching it. Elliot reached over and set something on the cushion between them, a small box. Nadia looked at it. She looked at him. "I wasn't going to do it like this," he said. "I had a plan, the restaurant by the park, the whole thing." He paused. "But then you came home today and you were tired, and you put your feet up, and I thought, this is exactly when I want to ask you, when it's just this." She looked at the box. She looked at him again. She thought about the airport, the umbrella, the 2 seconds that had almost been nothing. "Okay," she said. He opened the box. She said yes before she could see what was inside, which she realized afterward, and which made Elliot laugh, a real laugh caught off guard, the same way she'd heard him laugh in her parents' living room at Easter, a year and a half ago, and felt something she hadn't had a word for yet. She had a word for it now.